Okay, and welcome everyone, Bentley alumni, family, and friends, and partners of the CWB. Thank you for joining us again for today's virtual event. I'm Becky McDougall, Assistant Director of Events at the Center for Women in Business and Executive Education at Bentley University. I'm going to start out with just a few announcements before I turn things over to my colleague, Trish Foster, to lead you all in this session. So after today's session, we will be sending out an email with a survey to get your feedback, and we really value and use this feedback to deliver great programming to you all. So this email will also include some key slides from today's program full of resources, as well as a listing of upcoming virtual events. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for those. And thank you to those who submitted questions in advance. Trish will address several of your pre-submitted questions on this webinar towards the end of the program. But if you have a question arise as you're listening, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll consider it for response later on. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, but we'll be extending that time for those who do want to stay and ask additional questions. We know this topic tends to generate a lot of discussion, and we really want to honor that for you. So additionally, we hope to make today's webinar as interactive as possible, and we've enabled the chat box feature. So to participate via chat, please click on the chat feature in the menu bar and be sure to select all attendees and panelists when you respond to the entire group. And lastly, if you need technical assistance, please use the chat box to speak with us directly by selecting to speak with all panelists. My colleague, Emily Williams, Director of the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement, will be responding to your questions as best she can there. So again, use the Q&A box for any relevant topical questions, and we'll be coming to those at the end of the program, and the chat feature to engage in conversation during the session or to direct questions specifically to all panelists for any technical issues. And so with that, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Trish Foster, Executive Director of the Gloria Cordes Larson Center for Women in Business. And she's going to lead us all in learning about the importance of workplace allies. Thank you, Trish.
Thanks, Becky. And thank you to our colleagues in Alumni and Family Engagement who really reached out to collaborate in this new world all in right now. I want to extend a huge and warm welcome and thank you to all of you who are participating right now. We have a mix of corporate partners and alum and some colleagues across campus to join us today to delve into an issue that's really important to us in the Center for Women in Business. And, you know, maybe I'll go back for 1 second because there are some of you who don't know about our center. Our center is dedicated to advancing women in business, and that's kind of where our roots are. However, we have evolved significantly over the years, and we now really have a mission that's broader around diversity, equity, and inclusion for all. We do robust programming, a great deal of work in organizations and in businesses on specific diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. We do a great deal of thought leadership and curated research, and you can learn more at our website or by reaching out to us at any time. And on that note, I'll also say that as we talk today, yes, we have mechanisms set up to make this as interactive as possible in our quick hour we have together, but always know you can follow up with us afterwards via our website, and I also have my email on the closing slide. So again, thanks for being here and for caring. I want to note that this is a really safe and brave space for sharing and learning. And if we were all together in person, we would talk a lot more about that and what that means. And it would perhaps matter more too, right? Because we'd be asking questions spontaneously and live, and we'd be feeling each other's energy. Because sometimes what we're talking about gets a little uncomfortable. And on that note, what I want to say is, if you're feeling a little uncomfortable, it's because you're doing the good work. You're really diving in and caring. But we also kind of keep it light and positive as much as we can. This is real. We're all on a journey together. Nobody has all the answers. We never shame or blame. That accomplishes nothing. And it's easy when we talk about allyship especially male allyship, for people to end up feeling some guilt and carrying it, right? We know a lot of white men particularly are feeling that these days. And I want to say to you, please don't, because it will not help you learn and it will not help you step up as an ally. You'll also notice at times we have cartoons on slides. So it's okay to laugh, right? Let's not take ourselves too seriously. Okay, what are we going to do today? Real quickly, just so you know, in this really quick hour we have together, we're taking a very robust program, you a taste of it. We're starting out with some definitions, some basics, some facts and figures that you really need to get grounded in the data. And then we're talking about micro-inequities themselves, right? Because and you'll hear why micro-inequities are really important. We'll talk about what gets in the way of allyship, what prevents people from becoming allies, and especially the role of privilege. And there's a little bit of interactivity in both of those sections that I hope you'll find meaningful. And we close out with how to take action. This is usually really interactive with small group work and applications for organizations. Since we can't do that, I don't want to bore you by just reading a long laundry list. I'm going to give you a sampling, and then our Office of Alumni, Family, and Engagement will send out that portion of my deck to you afterwards. And like Becky said, we're going to have a Q&A. Okay, with that, let's go for it. Let's start with the basics. What's an ally, right? We all need to have agreement on what that is. An ally is a member of an advantaged group who can advocate for other people even when they're not in the room. There are certainly loads of other definitions, but I think that one is really, it really is simple and clear, right? It's, think about it. Will I speak up and will I advocate for this person even when they're not there? An important thing for all of us to remember who want to step up as allies is that we can't just proclaim ourselves an ally, right? It's really something that others bestow on us based on what they see us doing, based on what they see us saying and our action and our role modeling. Okay, we always start with the business imperative for diversity and inclusion. And for those of you who really work in the DE&I space, you know that this used to be a big issue to tackle. And it isn't anymore because most people know diversity, inclusion, and equity is good for businesses. It's good for the people in the organization. It's good for the customers. It's good for the clients. It's good for the business. So I use this one slide because I think it really just points out some of the many benefits to being a more inclusive organization, ranging from twice as likely to meet or exceed financial targets all the way up to 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. Okay, so we know, this is it, we know and we even accept that there's this great business case, but we also know we still have problems. That's why we're all still working together today to try to fix things. And so what I'm going to do now is share some data with you around some groups who are impacted by discrimination, by marginalization, and then by micro-inequities at times. And I'm going to start with gender. It's the big one. I like to use this particular graphic when I start out talking about gender disparity in the workplace because it's really clear. It's McKinsey's work, and I also love that every single year at the same time of year they update it. And most of all, I like it because it breaks out the journey for people of color. And you'll see that people of color are disproportionately impacted at every step in their careers. So what I want to note high level is if you look at the entry level on the far left of your screen, women are entering the workplace more or less on par with men. By the time we get up to the C-suite, we see how much we've fallen behind, right? This data, which came out about 4 or 5 months ago, shows that we're at about 22% representation as women in the C-suite. I talked about women of color, so what I want to do is actually talk about the Fortune 500 for a moment. We actually made real progress this year. We added about, we lost some and added some, but we went from about 32 women in the Fortune 500 leading it as CEOs to 38. Wow, that is fabulous progress in 1 year. I want you to keep in mind that that took us to only 7.5% of all CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And among those 38 women, exactly 1 is a Black woman. Okay, what about other groups besides women? I'm pulling out some. Again, this could be much more robust. Latinos, about at a rate of about 75%, indicate that they have to repress aspects of who they are at work. They have to hide part of their identity. Okay, and we know that when people have to do this, when they can't bring their authentic selves to the workplace, they are not able to engage as fully. They are not able to be as productive. And that impacts the business. And often, these are the folks who end up leaving. Good employees leave, and they find a place where they can thrive. Similar data exists for folks who identify as LGBTQ. Harder to get that data because it's all based on self-identification, but the data that we have shows that about 50% of LGBTQ employees are closeted at work, and we know that number is far higher for people who identify as trans. This is some data on financial services organizations in the US, and I really like to use it because so many people who graduate from Bentley go into financial services, and because it's really pretty representative of industry as a whole. And I think this graphic with that very tiny triangle says it all. So 3% of senior positions in US financial services organizations are held by African Americans. And a moment ago I talked about women of color in the Fortune 500, leading the Fortune 500, and I'd like to do the same right now for African American men. So I said that there were 38 women CEOs this week leading the Fortune 500, right? So do the math quickly, that brings you down to 462 men leading Fortune 500 companies, and among them, 4 are African American men, 4. Okay, and there's quite a bit of other data that speaks to the unique experiences of people with different identities. Class migrants, immigrants, veterans, people with disabilities. We know that Asian Americans face very unique stereotypes and challenges in the workplace. And this is something that if any of you want to follow up with me on, I'd be happy to get more data for you about. What's important to know is that all of these subgroups, people who identify in all of these different ways, experience discrimination and micro-inequities at a higher rate. And so that brings us to the topic of micro-inequities. Or sometimes you'll hear the term microaggressions. Sometimes you'll even hear the term subtle acts of exclusion. Before I dig into them, I want to make sure you have a little bit of a framework of how we get to this spot of micro-inequities. So if you'll bear with me, this is a journey I'm going to take you through that we would normally spend a lot of time on if we were all together in a multi-hour session. All individuals, all humans, based on our life experiences and based on our brain wiring, our brain's tendency to revert to fast, quick thinking, right? To be efficient, to keep us alive. Based on this fast thinking, life experience, we all carry unconscious bias, okay? And in brief, the definition that I like to use for unconscious bias, there are so many, is actually from Vernia Myers, a thought leader in the DE&I space. And she says, unconscious bias is the stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Okay, so we go from our brain's fast thinking and our life experiences to unconscious bias. And this unconscious bias that all of us carry leads us to at times perpetrate micro-inequities or microaggressions. We all do it. Okay, what are they? Micro-inequities are subtle, unintentional slights. Here's what's really interesting. So many fabulous organizations committed to diversity and inclusion. They're caring, they're progressive, they're addressing diversity and inclusion, are still held back by micro-inequities. And that's why this is where I'm kind of pausing and spending time. Because in order to become an effective ally, you really have to understand how other people are impacted by micro-inequities. And that this really is what I like to say, the sticky floor in most great organizations with good cultures. So these subtle and unintentional slights, and I'm going to get into examples in a few moments, wear people down over time. So are a few okay? Absolutely. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all say something unintentional to someone that might be rude or insensitive, right? But day in and day out, for people who are marginalized, they're experiencing these regularly. So it's as if they're experiencing pinpricks or paper cuts at a really intense rate, right? What does this mean? Here we go again, back to this comment I made earlier. Ultimately, this can result in people becoming disengaged and demoralized and less productive and leaving the organization. What are some examples? I can't tell you how much I wish we could all be talking to each other right now. There's nothing like doing this in person. Here are a few though. Who's given the office housekeeping? This is still the first one that comes up in pretty much every workshop I ever run. Office housekeeping, meaning cleaning up, planning social events, taking notes. It's very gendered. It also often falls to the most junior people. And yes, indeed, at times it's part of someone's job description, but there are many times when it's not, and it just spills over and becomes a permanent way of doing things. Who's heard in meetings? What's going on with the introverts? What's going on with people according to their status or according to their gender? Whose accomplishments are recognized and whose aren't? Whose judgment is questioned, right? We know the data tells us that people of color have their judgment questioned in their area of expertise more often. Who's included in social activities, who isn't? What are the social activities? And today in 2020, the story that we hear in pretty much every workshop we go into, and it just really amazes me, is that the go-to social activity is still golf, and that really excludes many people. I want to talk about being the token or the only for a moment. Being the only is not a micro-inequity. It's that onlys are often treated as tokens, which I'll explain in 1 second, and that onlys experience higher rates of discrimination. And I am gratified that we see more research on the experience of the only in the workplace now than we did a few years ago. If you are an only, or if you are aware that there's someone on the team you work on that's an only, I hope that this session might help you be more aware of their experiences. And that only might be the only older person, the only younger person, the only veteran, the only person with a disability. Onlys are often expected to speak on behalf of their group, and that is when they're tokenized. That's when they're treated as the token, and that becomes the micro-inequity. People from underrepresented groups are much more frequently asked what people from their group think than people from the majority group. The mommy penalty refers to a host of slights and examples of discrimination that women tend to experience once they have children. And this may be something as basic as they've just had children and they've just come back from their parental leave, and they are people even trying to be supportive of them. So people are well-meaning and they don't give them as many assignments. They don't give them as many stretch assignments, right? They don't ask them to travel. And that is a micro-inequity if it's not discussed, because there will be people who come back and are now a mother and maybe do want a different track, and there are others who won't. So you often also hear the term the mommy track. It is a significant issue in the workplace, much more significant than most people would think. Women tend to fall behind after they've had children, and they tend never to catch back up. And of course, this impacts not just their career trajectory, but their wages. And then the last two on there, I'll just mention quickly. I think that the second to last bullet's pretty clear. Demeaning or insensitive remarks and jokes. And ageism is a real issue. And by the way, that's at both ends of the spectrum, okay? And we hear a lot about that when we're running workshops as well, and often have really good discussions around it. This is just a sampling. What I would like to do now is invite you to use the chat feature to share your own example. This can be something that you've experienced. It can be something you've talked to someone else about or you've observed. So I'm going to give you a moment to go ahead and do that. I hope we get some participation. This is a bit of an experiment. Okay, a lot's coming up now. Thanks for waiting, everybody. So, wow. So here we go. One person is saying that she pumped for a year. She had, when she came back from maternity leave, and someone else told her that she was frustrated because people always had to wait for her to finish pumping. Somebody else says that they always experience being talked over in meetings. Another person said that the women in her office are all expected to order the lunch or get the coffee. Another person says that they experience being the only in their office and that it's hard. Someone else is saying that their communication skills are questioned regularly because English isn't their first language. And then one person saying that as a queer person, so somebody identifies as queer, she presents as female, she gets invited to women in business events, but they don't align with her gender identity. And she said it can be really tough to be reminded that her gender identity doesn't align with other women. There is a lot coming in here. One man here says he identifies as gay, and he says he's in a customer service role and he's always told to man up when he's working with customers, and that's really hard. When I'm on a sales call, this person says, I have an older white male colleague who always assumed to be the boss, even though he's not. This person says there are often times when she's the only Latina in the room, also the oldest, and trying to engage with younger people to feel included and struggles with it. Another person talks about how they always have to take the notes in the meetings as the most junior person in the room. Another person talks about experiencing really blatant racism. This person says they moved to Florida from the Northeast, not that geography necessarily matters, right? But that it was a real rude awakening for them. And then this person says, if you're an extroverted woman, you're labeled as a dragon woman. Wow, everybody, thank you. These are really powerful. And, you know, this is, as I said, a little bit of an experiment. I didn't know how it would work. This gives us a little bit of a feel for what people just on this webinar are willing to share right now. And really gets us thinking more of the impact of micro-inequities, right? Okay, and this understanding of micro-inequities now that we have, this better understanding and better sensitivity of it, helps us in our journey to becoming allies, right? And so it's a reminder of the experiences people have and why they need allies. which leads us directly to really what's the next module in this webinar, which is what gets in the way of allyship? What prevents us from becoming allies? Again, this is the next thing we need to address in order to become allies. We have to know what might prevent us, what might trip us up. Okay, and I'm going to go through a little bit about unconscious bias, misconceptions, fear, and privilege, which is the most interesting, and where we'll have another little interactive exercise. So these are the things I want you to think about. And again, I'm going to move through them a little bit quickly. Take a moment to smile if you want to at my cartoon. I apologize that most of the cartoons are gendered. That's just most of them out there. At any rate, let's talk a little bit about one of the first stumbling blocks, and that's misconceptions and fears. And we all have them. And I want to say with all humility, as I do this work, to try to step up as an ally to others, that this is probably the hardest thing for me, the fear factor. What I've had to do, and I'm still working on it, is embrace the fact that I'm going to make mistakes. See, this is the fear, right? Like, to step up means we're going to make mistakes. That's just a trade-off you have to get comfortable with. There are going to be times where maybe you speak out on behalf of someone and maybe you didn't need to, right? Maybe it wasn't the right moment, but you got to be willing to do that. Okay, so just to summarize, that's my story, but to summarize this slide a little bit, a lot of people are committed, but they just aren't sure how. That's why sessions like this are great for all of us. Some men, specifically when we talk about male allies, know that gender bias is a problem, right? But they feel awkward. And this is especially an issue in the age of Me Too. And we're going to come back to this a little bit when we talk about strategies to be a good ally. There are people out there who do think gender equality is a zero-sum game, right? So like if you succeed, I fall behind. So what I would just say to that right in the moment is that if you can think of it this way, it might help you if you're struggling with this. We are not taking places away at the table. We're making the table bigger. We're setting more places at the table, okay? What are some other stumbling blocks for us that can prevent us from becoming allies? There actually are people out there who do think gender bias isn't a problem. And again, I just have to call it out. I don't think many, but it's there, and there is research that you can see on the screen that indicates that it's real. There are people who fear or perceive backlash for taking action. This is a big one. We have had pretty incredible, authentic conversations with people in workshops that we run around this. And in one that I just ran recently, one man, he's a consultant, he said, my social capital is everything, and I can't risk losing that. And I was actually really proud of him for being willing to admit that and admit that he's fearful of it. And we discussed it. And what I can tell you is, excuse me, there's really good data out there to indicate that the one group that doesn't have to fear any backlash, any loss in their social capital are white men. And instead of that making you feel badly if you're a white man, what I want to say is I hope that empowers you. And then there's this last issue I have up here on this slide, which is about people saying, like, I treat everybody the same. It's sort of that equality thing. So if I treat everybody the same, I'm not being biased, and I don't need to worry about being an ally, right? But we know, a lot of us now know, that treating everybody the same actually tends to put people in a box. That's like saying I'm colorblind, right? To say you don't see color is actually offensive to a person of color, right? Because it's sort of saying you don't see them, you don't see their identity. And then there's the big one and the interesting one that can get in our way of being an ally, and that is privilege. So let's live with this one for a few moments, okay? Privilege. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that's denied to others solely because of the group they belong to. Right? So privilege is highly valued. Remember that we all carry some form of it though. Okay, so even those of us who are often disadvantaged carry some form of privilege based on their life experience. So there are times when that privilege can show up. It's really important to remember that we can be privileged without feeling it. And that being privileged being privileged can mean we don't have to think about certain topics or experience certain types of behavior. So it's, in other words, sometimes privilege is what we don't have to experience, what we don't have to think about. A really good, simple example I think I can give you that most people get is, for the most part, most men don't have to be worried about walking alone at night, say, as much as most women do. That's a form of privilege. Now, before we move on, and you'll probably hear me say it again, I want you to understand, if you don't already, that privilege is not a sin. You're not doing anything wrong by holding privilege. It's what you do with it that matters, okay? And so I hope you're feeling like you have your head around privilege and what it is. And what I'd like to do now is invite you to participate in a poll. This is based on a long assessment that we usually do with over 20 statements that ask people to think about whether each statement applies to them or not. So I've pulled 8 questions out, and here the poll has already come up. I want you to think about which of these statements applies to you. And I'm going to be quiet for about a minute and let you just think of that and try to just do a mental tally as you read them about whether yes, it applies to you or no, it doesn't. I'll be quiet, as I said, for about a minute.
Okay, another 30 seconds for the poll.
Okay, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for voting. And so far, it looks like 40% of you found that all 8 statements apply. And another almost 40 say at least 5 do. And then you go down to 1 person who says at least 1 statement applies. And so, Becky, if I'm talking to my co-pilot here, if it's okay, should we close the poll or leave it open for another moment?
Poll is now closed. So Trish, go ahead and.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks to all the participants for bearing with us as we experiment with some new ways to do interactive sessions with you. So What I'd like to do now is process with you virtually about the takeaway from having done this. So there were a lot of people who checked almost all the boxes, right? Or all of them. I want to ask you to think about whether there was an aha moment for you. And maybe some of this will come back to us in the Q&A session in a few minutes. Was there an aha moment? I will tell you that when we do this live with our long assessment and lots of talking and thinking, almost always someone raises their hand and says, I checked every box. And remember, that's 20 some. And that they say, wow, you know, this was an aha moment for me. I've never sat and thought about all the ways I carry privilege and realize what a privileged person I am, or what a lucky person I am. I want you to think about how you're feeling. So a little bit of a touchy-feely moment. I'm kind of tapping into your cognitive reaction as well as your emotional reaction here. If you have a little bit of a, you know, an awkward, a little bit of a sick feeling in your stomach, that's normal. Like, this is uncomfortable, right? That's okay. Because remember what I said earlier, holding privilege is not a sin. It's not wrong. What matters is how we use it. And that's the perfect segue into the final section of my presentation before we open it up for questions. And that's the remedies, the solutions. And I want to remind you again, because I am going to move fast through a lot of material, that we are going from our Office of Alum, Faculty, and Engagement, we're going to be sending out this portion of my deck, so that if you want to look at other things or think about them and then follow up with us via email later, you absolutely can do that. Okay, so this first slide has the buckets that I'm going to move through, so to speak, the categories of strategies to be an ally. Right? The first thing we need to do is increase our self-awareness. Wow, we have to do the hard work on ourselves, right? We have to expand our perspectives. We have to be leaders. We have to step up and lead the way and be a role model. We can think about systems and processes in some cases to check bias and to check micro-inequities. We can think about how we take action in the moment. That's always my favorite because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's easy to do. And then finally, I talk about supporting open dialogue and modeling courageous conversations. And that is something that's particularly important to us in the Center for Women in Business, because we do a lot of work around courageous conversations. We utilize them and we conduct sessions teaching organizations how to use them, and more organizations are understanding how important that is. Okay, so here we go. That first category, increasing self-awareness. So I'm going to call out like one or maybe two statements on every slide. The one I'm going to call out on this one is, if you do nothing else, I really advise you to take the implicit association test. It is, if you can just literally Google Harvard implicit bias test and it'll come right up. And I apologize, I am looking at some messages that are coming through from the other people who are running the webinar with me, just on how things are going technically. I'm not stopping to check my Instagram on my phone while I'm talking to you today. So anyway, back to the implicit association test. It is really illuminating. It's also fun. There are multiple tests. Some are about gender, some are about race, some are about sexual orientation. And you really learn a lot. And it's interesting once you take one to go back and retake it, once or twice a year. So I advise that. It's a cool way to begin your journey of greater self-awareness. Expanding perspectives. We know that senior executives and CEOs with more diverse networks drive greater firm value. And yet, 70% of mentoring relationships are still same gender, same race. So we have a lot to overcome here. So I would say, work really hard on diversifying your own network. Does everybody look like you? If so, maybe you can start to change that. And learn more about people who are different than you. Again, there's clear data out there to show that the more we know and understand about people who are different than us, the more we bridge the divide that exists between people. The more we break down the barriers, the more we decrease discrimination. I mentioned Me Too earlier and allyship. It's really important, and it comes up all the time. And every once in a while when I'm running a session and it doesn't come up, I now bring it up because I say, I know it's out there. And the minute I do, the floodgates kind of open, right? I mean, this needs to be discussed. We know the data. We know that the proportion of men who say they're uncomfortable mentoring women or being alone with women has skyrocketed since Me Too. And so we have to address it. It is absolutely critically linked to this topic of allyship. And so, first of all, I do have to say, if you have issues in your workplace as an ally, you better be prepared to address them, right? That's why that third bullet goes right to it. But more often than not, it's these other issues. It's this subtlety of, I just don't feel comfortable anymore. How do I handle this? And the bullet I want to call out on that is work to create a more open culture of dialogue. Talk about it. I've seen some really transformational moments in workshops we've run with men and women around allyship in the past year where just that has happened. And I'll give you one example. A man spoke up in a session I ran recently and said, I have to tell you, I'm one of those men who feels really uncomfortable now. And then a woman in the same room told her story, which was, well, I've got to tell you, I want to share with you how I'm feeling because a man who I've worked with for years, who's not in this room now, now insists on meeting with me in the hallway. He doesn't meet with me in his office anymore. And it led to an honest and a respectful discussion across difference. And it also generated an incredibly strong reaction on the part of a lot of men in the room when that woman told her story who had no idea that was happening. And they shared how badly they felt. So I think you all know where I'm going. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate more on that story. But I think it's really instructional and a great example of the progress we can make if we're willing to start talking honestly and authentically and respectfully with each other about what we're experiencing and what we're feeling. The next category that we share is called leading the way. Okay, so this really gets into modeling. You want to model really positive professional relationships with people who are different than you. Let people see you doing that. I can't say enough about mentorship and sponsorship. They are so impactful. And I already mentioned that despite how beneficial it can be to mentor or sponsor someone different than you, the vast majority of mentoring relationships are still same gender and same race. Some of you may have an opportunity to do more around implementing processes, programs, systems, policies to make a difference. And if you have that opportunity, I would, encourage you to really support it. One that can be really simple, even if you don't feel that you have the power to do anything major in your organization, is to make sure you're recognizing all the voices in the room when you are in a meeting. Maybe amplifying for the person whose voice isn't heard as often. So that means, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure many do, is, say someone speaks and they tend to be more soft-spoken or more tentative about how they assert themselves or assert their opinions. When you hear them say something, repeat it and acknowledge that they're the ones who shared it. That's called amplification. Inclusive language is about things as simple as using pronouns in your signature. So we do that in the Center for Women in Business. So if you get an email from me, at the bottom of the email next to my name, you'll see pronouns, she, her, hers, letting people know I identify as a woman. That's sending a signal that you recognize people no matter how they identify. Okay, another bucket, another category is calling out bias when you see it in the moment, right? And a great example here is asking questions instead of accusing. And this accomplishes two things. First of all, it's a subtle and respectful way to maybe call somebody out if they did say something they shouldn't have said or do something they shouldn't have done. But quite often, asking that question clarifies for you yourself. So say you're the one who feels that perhaps you experienced a slight, and you ask a question, you might be surprised how often you realize, that really wasn't a slight, I just misunderstood. A personal favorite of mine is saying ouch. We've adopted it in our center. It's quick, it's easy, and it makes the point. You'll notice that I have a visual on this one, which is a rainbow flag. And the reason is because it reminds me of a really great story. A friend and colleague who identifies as trans was going for a job interview and really nervous about the fact that she identifies she identifies differently, she's gender nonconforming, and felt that it was going to be a problem. And she walked into this interview, and in the person's pencil holder was a rainbow flag. And it changed everything in a split second. And she knew she was in a safe place. And in fact, the interview went well, and the end of the story is a great one. And I just think that's a beautiful story of how little things can make such a difference. We spend a lot of time in longer sessions talking about what women can do. And we're running a little bit short on time. So again, remember, you're going to get this information sent to you. What I just want to add is that as women, because so much of allyship is about male allies, we have to meet our male allies halfway. We have to communicate clearly with them. We have to have strong, authentic dialogue. We have to be an ally to them. We have to invite them into our groups and into our networks, right? So there's a lot we can do, and we need to be aware of that. The last thing we should do as women when we're talking about male allies is put them on the sidelines and then expect them to step up. And last, I talked about courageous conversations. All I want to say is this is a phenomenal tool to engage in uncomfortable feedback, to bridge difference. And if you are interested in learning more about courageous conversations, please reach out to us. They are incredibly effective in bridging difference. And with that, we are at a point where we have time to take some questions and comments. And I'm hoping that my colleague is going to be able to, but it sounds like perhaps not.
Oh, I'm going to start with...
Okay, there, it's working. Sorry, everybody.
I'm going to start with a question from the pre-submitted questions. So thank you for those who submitted their questions in advance. So Jack Lee, graduate in 2011, is wondering how he can get allies to attend employee resource group events, and how to make allies feel included during these programs. So Trish, if you can address that question.
Love that. Thank you, Jack. So, wow, first of all, I just love that you're even bringing employee resource groups into the conversation, right? Because they're so critical, A, in terms of providing a safe space for people, but B, in terms of bridging divide, right? Because employee resource groups can really help make everybody feel more included in an organization by working together. So I would say what you want to do is definitely invite those allies, those people who you want to be allies, to your events. And do more than just invite them. Ask them to sponsor you in some way. Ask them to support the programs that your ERG is doing. Maybe hold a fireside chat at one of your events with that person, it's really important, again, to engage them. Tell them why they're valuable. Let them know, because so often they don't even know. Did I answer both parts of that question?
Thank you, Trish.
Okay.
Yes, and so we have another great question. Someone who says, I want allies, but I don't want to be rescued when I can advocate for myself. So how do you work with allies to educate them about the difference between allyship and perhaps rescuing someone?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's a hard one. It's especially hard for me as a white woman who's mostly in the privileged in group, right? Who feels like, for those of you who have been listening, this is one of my fears, right? And I think there are times when I've done this. So the first thing I actually want to say is, I hope, because the person who's asking this question sounds like they might be someone who wants an ally and is concerned that maybe allies have done this for them. I would actually ask you to meet your ally halfway and understand that there might be times when they do maybe speak on your behalf and shouldn't, and be willing to talk to them about that. I would really hope that if you have that constructive relationship with someone who's willing to be an ally for you, they can also hear you say to them, hey, you know, I really appreciated your advocating for me today, but I actually didn't need you to on that one, and here's why. So again, it's all about us teaching each other. I would also tell you that when we run allyship workshops that are longer and real time, we literally simulate moments like that where we help people and we give them more tricks.
Thank you. And I have another pre-submitted question. Arlenis Almonte, graduate of 2007. How do you successfully, what's the first step to getting someone to become an ally? How do you get others to listen and take that step to become an ally? We hope that some of you are taking that into consideration from today's discussion as well.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that those of you who, including, I'm so sorry I didn't catch which alum it was, but including the person who's participating and submitted this question in advance, feels like he or she got some answers today. But I would say, because I would say that the catalyst for somebody to become an ally varies depending on who they are. For some people, it's understanding the facts and figures. It's going, wow, I had no idea, because a lot of people don't. So it's being armed with data that really impacts some people. But for a lot of people, it's doing something like that privilege assessment where they have the aha moment by self-examination, right? Or it's hearing stories. And that's why, you know, I wasn't able to get into that, but the power of storytelling is tremendous. And by the way, employee resource groups, ERGs, can often be a great vehicle for storytelling, where you can host events where people do that, because hearing other people's stories is so powerful. And I would tell you one of the things that men tell us most often, and this is again specifically about male allyship, and that is what's so important, because we really do know that the most important allies in most workplaces are men, and specifically white men. And what they tell us most often is how deeply impacted they are by the women in their lives. And you know, sometimes people are critical of that. I'm not. If that's what it takes, I mean, that's our personal experience. That's our lived experience. Use that. There's data out there that even shows that judges who have daughters make determinations in legal cases in favor of women more often based on that experience they've had as a father. So the power of our experiences with other people is tremendous. I hope those thoughts helped answer that question.
Thank you, Trish. I'm going to take a second now to pause and just go through a few quick announcements. But like I said at the beginning, we're going to continue on for a few extra minutes. Those who can stay past 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time can continue on in this conversation, and we'll be here to answer questions. But for those who do have to end right at the hour, I'm going to take a second to go through some upcoming events. And so first, as I mentioned, again, you're going to get an email with a portion of today's slides, with resources, virtual events, and a survey for today's program. Again, we deeply value your feedback, and we'll continue to deliver and improve our virtual programs using that feedback. So thank you for taking the time to complete that survey. Next week, the Center for Women in Business will again be partnering with the Office of Alumni Engagement to deliver an impactful virtual program. This time, it's Inclusion 2.0, Intersectionality in the Workplace. That session will be led by Jaro Fong Olivares, Associate Director of the CWB and Executive Education, and that's on April 8th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you'll see the link to register in that upcoming events listing. Also led by Jaro is an executive education program, our Leadership Breakfast Series, and that's all about courageous conversations. And I think some of the questions that I'm seeing come through were actually very much related to this idea of courageous conversations. And so in a second, I think Trish will get into some of those questions as well, but that's going to be a great program on April 14th. We also have our Gearing Up program on June 4th. We are planning to deliver that virtually. We're very excited about it and have a one-day program for emerging leaders. And you'll see the registration info again in that chat as well. And so we're thrilled to bring that to you. And so again, any research and upcoming programs, as well as if you'd like to reach out to Trish with more questions, again, pfoster@bentley.edu, and you will get this second half of the slide deck with that contact information as well. We're thrilled for all of you that could join us, and for those who want to continue to ask questions, we'll be here for a few more minutes as well, so thank you all. And so Trish, again, we kind of talked about courageous conversations a little bit just now. How do you give an ally feedback about their micro-inequities without losing their allyship? I think if you could talk a little bit more about that, courageous conversations or some other tactics for what people might expect at some of our upcoming programs too.
Well, you know, these are really great and challenging questions, by the way. I'm really impressed. This is, again, something that we really get into a great deal in a lot of the workshops we run, and this goes to the core of courageous conversations. So you have to be willing to take the risk and to have authentic conversation. And so that begins with letting someone know that you wish to share some information with them. So, right, so let's envision right now that Becky and I, you know, that Becky is my ally, right? And she keeps like speaking up for me just a little bit too much maybe, right? And I feel like I'm actually losing my voice in her efforts to be an ally. I would probably do something like say, Becky, first of all, ask if she has time to talk. Like, don't just spring it on her in the hallway when I run into her, and just ask her, Becky, do you have a few minutes to chat with me about something that's important to me? And hopefully, if she's your ally, she's going to say yes. And if not, we would talk about some ways you can approach that. But let's say she says yes, and you sit down and you let her know before you start that you want to share something with great respect, right? And that it's maybe a little bit hard for you. It's always good to acknowledge that you maybe are feeling uncomfortable, because again, that's the human connection. And then you let them know how much you appreciate their efforts, right? Like, you are trying to be an ally for me, and that means so much to me. I deeply appreciate your advocacy. I want to share with you something that I'm thinking maybe you could do a little differently, or maybe has tripped me up a few times, right? And share it. And ask that person to reflect on it and share with you how they feel, rather than accusing them, right? Say, you know, Becky, for instance, the other day in a meeting, you spoke on my behalf at a moment where I didn't really feel like it was necessary, and this is why, and this is how I experienced it. Can you tell me what you thought about that? And give Becky that chance to respond and reflect without feeling too much guilt or too much anger. right? I hope this is helping. I mean, this is complex stuff. This isn't easy to answer in, 1 minute. And then the conversation can go from there. Remember that it's okay not to reach a conclusion at the end of that conversation. Maybe you just delve into it the first time with your ally and say, hey, we can talk about this some more. We can both walk away from this and think, maybe we'll both have some other great ideas for each other. I hope this is helping.
That's great. And we'll be sure to send out more information on that Courageous Conversations Bentley Executive Education Program as part of the resources and the email with the survey as well.
Great.
And so I'm going to look through and see if there are more questions. I think, again, some of this is covered by Courageous Conversations, or even the intersectionality conversations that are going to occur in the upcoming weeks. How do you, Trish, address inclusion across multiple departments, perhaps kind of a matrix organization? You might have multiple authorities. This question came in from Ed Demerit of the class of 1990. Again, looking at allyship across departments or across a government organization, perhaps.
Wow, another fabulous question. Thank you so much for asking this. Yeah, it gets complicated, and it also makes me think about middle managers and frontline managers. I think that it goes to that challenge we have as well, that when we do DE&I work, not just around allyship, but any kind, the question often becomes, are we getting it to everybody in the organization, right? And we know one thing for sure, and so this answers part of your question. It has to start at the top. So that's one way you get it to different departments and different divisions. If it is mandated and expected and modeled by the people at the top, it will have an impact on the rest of the organization. However, that sometimes isn't enough, right? We sometimes see that, we actually refer to it as the frozen middle, that the information and the practices and the programs and processes don't make it all the way through the organization. And usually that's due to a lot of factors. That's due to a breakdown in communications, or it's due to the fact that there isn't that real commitment at the top, and the people at the top aren't making sure it's funneled through the rest of the organization. So I would say, though, some things you can do, even if, maybe everything at the top isn't working, is you can organize informal employee groups, like almost informal diversity councils, where you have representatives from all of those different teams to share best practices around allyship. Grassroots efforts are very effective. So even though I said the top is really important, there is a lot that can be done, and I've seen it done by grassroots efforts. There's an amazing program that AT&T has developed. It started grassroots, one person. She decided that she needed to be stepping up more as an ally, and one thing she was going to do was start having conversations with people she didn't know who looked different than her. She started having coffee. Like once a month, I'm going to do coffee. It spread like wildfire through the organization. It now has an acronym. It's called DINE. It does stand for something, but D-I-N-E. It is so popular. I was actually talking about it in a workshop with a group of people I didn't know that well one day, and a man raised his hand and said, I work for AT&T and I'm doing one of these DINE programs tomorrow. It truly has spread through our organization. And so that's a way to, get it through your organization and get it into different groups, even if you don't have a formal structure to do so.
Thank you. And I think that's all of our questions for today.
All right.
Participating in our polls, participating in our chat. Trish, let you sign off.
Yeah. For whoever is still here, I just want to thank you so much for your commitment to this issue and for participating, and let you know we're here if you want to reach out, and take really good care of yourselves.